something? Let me take the chair. Yeah, I've got chairs. All right, we're okay. Whew, boy, this sun's a bit hot. My goodness, I'm glad I got my sun hat.
Yeah, me too.
Wow.
Some of us haven't got so much protection up top.
No, indeed. Right, you've got a 10.
Yeah, I have no idea how this thing goes up.
Well,
It could be quite explosive.
ping. I think it'll ping.
Right.
It's a ping kind of 10.
Okay.
Oh, this is a good spot, isn't it?
It's beautiful.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Okay, here we go.
Hey! Brilliant, brilliant. Don't forget to get the opening in the right place.
No, that's right.
That's it.
We're there. Lovely.
Great. There's the chair. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, look at that view.
Well,
Look
yeah.
at that view. I think I can see
Just
the
what
sea.
you want, isn't it, really?
Wow. Oh.
Yeah.
Perfect weather. Sun shining. You've got some drinks there.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
We've got the tent. We've got the chairs. Superb.
Everything we need.
Everything we need.
Lovely.
Got a drink?
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. Cheers.
Oh, cheers
We've
indeed.
arrived.
Yeah.
We got here.
And now to relax. You know, I've been looking forward to this for so long.
So right, it's been a hard weekend,
It
hasn't it?
has, and a long journey to get here.
Long journey,
Oh.
long journey. You're
That
lots of traffic.
queue. Oh,
Haven't they got a great car park here?
it is. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Yeah,
And we've got a space.
we've got a space.
Oh,
We've got a big space.
we do it.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
can open the door without hitting another car.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Do you know what? If I really strain over there, like that, past the Mini Cooper and the BMW, I think I can see the sea.
Oh yeah, over there between the land and the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all right, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
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 If you look that way,
Yeah.
yeah, just up beyond the rest of the cars.
Well, where the coaches are.
Yeah. You just see Dartmoor.
Can you?
Yeah.
God.
It's lovely.
Oh, it's nice. We can just relax.
We can.
Yeah. You locked the car, didn't you?
Yes.
Great.
You know what? This would be a brilliant spot. That view would be amazing.
It would, it would.
If it wasn't for that dead great 4x4 in front of us.
Right. Perhaps we better go then. Another time. I hope you kind of got the general impression there. Have you ever been on these days out where you turn up in a car park and you see people that are having their picnic by their car? I'm sorry if that's you. And I've always thought, why? Why? When if you just walk a bit further, you can leave the people behind, you can leave the car park behind, and you've got a beautiful spot to have your picnic. I've entitled, or God gave me the title for this morning of Don't Pitch Your Tent Too Early. Don't pitch your tent too early. And we're going to take a bit of a journey through the wonderful narrative that is our Bible, of what happens when we travel and when we perhaps pitch our tent too early. But first of all, I'll share a story with you of the point at which I was called into ministry, which, like most of you here, was a fairly challenging time. Our people in our congregations think we just walked into this and woke up one day and thought it would be a good idea. I bet you didn't, because I didn't. And aside from external challenges, which were a challenge to my journey towards ministry, there was many an internal challenge, just as great, if not greater. And one of my internal challenges was really saying to God, well, God, I am a wife. I am a mum. Was I grandmum then? Yes, I think I was to my stepchildren. I'm a grandmother. I'm a daughter. And the big one was the fact that I was a daughter, because My mum in her 80s lived about 5 minutes away from where we lived. And whilst I'm one of 4 siblings, the others were at least an hour and a half away, if not 2 hours. We were the main carer for my mum in her 80s. God was rattling my cage big time to say, guess what, I've got a fun time ahead of you. I want you to follow me. I want you to step out and follow me. And I'm saying, but I can't, because I knew I'd be leaving the town where I lived. And in the end, God's rattling of my cage became so loud, I thought, I have to talk to her. I have to talk to her. And she used to come round for Sunday lunch quite regularly. And so one Sunday I said, look, Mum, she'd sit in the kitchen when I was cooking dinner. I think God is telling me to do this. I think God is calling me into the ministry. The amazing Christian lady that she was, she says to me, so she lived in sheltered accommodation. She had a flat in sheltered accommodation. She said, I'd been wondering why I was thinking of moving back to Berkshire. I'm like, what? You didn't say anything. And my brother lived in Wokingham in Berkshire. And she and Dad had lived in Woodley, near Wokingham. Some years before, they had moved across to Essex when my dad was unwell. And she, in her flat, was thinking, I think maybe I'll move back to Woodley. It was to do with the church context. I didn't know that as God was trying to uproot me, cause me to move, cause me to travel, cause me to journey, he was actually doing the same thing for my 80-odd-year-old mother. It's incredible, isn't it? We put all the problems there and God just solves them. So that's just a little bit of a story about this issue that we have all felt at some point in our life of being called to leave, to be uprooted. God makes us uncomfortable and tells us to go. Now, I am not this morning encouraging all the EBA ministers here to go to the YBA or other various parts of the country, but I am challenging us about where you pitch your tent, and have you pitched your tent too early? Are you still prepared to be journeying into the unknown with God? So there's this man, Abraham, isn't there? And Abraham, actually, we read, is quite settled with his family in the land of Haran. And we don't have a sense of how long they're there, but we do know they are settled there. His father Terah dies, and there's a definite sense that this is home. And this is where Abraham's territory is, if you like. This so far completely unknown character, God the Creator, calls to fashion an alternative, creative community for God's creation, which has up until this point been a bit of a disaster, really, hasn't it? God knocks on Abraham's door and says, get up and go, as we read in Genesis 12. The Lord said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a greater nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham departed as the Lord had said, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot and all his wealth, to his livestock, and all the people he had taken into the household of Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abraham travelled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh, and at that time the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abraham built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord, who had appeared to him. After that, Abraham travelled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. Then Abraham continued travelling south by stages towards the Negev. And we read here that he travelled and he settled. And he travelled and he settled. And then we're left with the final phrase of, and he travelled further on to the Negev. And we actually know that turns out he ends up in Egypt, doesn't he? Now, whilst travelling the land may have been much more common in Abraham's time as it is now, and maybe he was a nomad, maybe he was a merchant, there's various theories about what he could have been, he still had to leave the place where he was settled and go with this God who was calling him to go and saying these incredible things. You have been called, and potentially you left everything for God at some point in your life. You are still actually journeying. You are still travelling. Or are you? And are you engaged in creating an alternative community for the kingdom of God, being part of God's creativeness for our world? Well, what happens when we journey, apart from pitching our tent too early in a car park? Well, I think quite a lot of this happens when you travel. Moaning and grumbling. Are we nearly there yet? If any of you have travelled with children, you have heard that cry. And maybe it's come from the Bible in the first place. You know, I think perhaps it has. You see, there's another familiar story, isn't there? When the Israelites leave Egypt, a miraculous thing occurs. These thousands, hundreds of thousands people leave Egypt, and then they land up at the water's edge of this raving Red Sea, and the enemy is pursuing them, and basically they're thinking, we're dead meat. Almighty God intervenes through Moses. As Moses raises his staff and the waters part, they walk through. The crashing Egyptians get drowned. Oh, it's a great film, isn't it? It's a wonderful story. And at this point, the people are like, yes, Moses, we'll follow you wherever you lead us because you're wonderful. Yeah? Is that what happens? Well, for a while. But not very long, because within 2 chapters, just 2 chapters, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat round pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out of this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. They've just got a little bit of drama in there, haven't they? Just a little bit. God intervenes and provides water and manna and quail, you know, in God's good thing. But my word, they have moaning and grumbling down to a T. How about you? Any moaning or grumbling? Well, after 2 months, just 2 months, having got over a few hiccups, they set camp at the foot of Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain to receive God's word for them all. They bless him and send him on his way, I presume. That's not actually written down. He's gone for quite a while. It takes up 10 chapters. I don't know what time 10 chapters is. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. Maybe David can tell me. I don't know. Takes up 10 chapters of Moses up the mountain, receiving the word from the Lord. What happens to the people? They kind of... Oh, wrong one. I've just jumped ahead in my... No, I've lost my... Oh, I've got my pictures in the wrong order. Hang on a second. I want that one. We'll go back to the other one. It's called Turning Back. That's good, isn't it? What happens? They turn to Aaron and basically say, make us an idol who can lead us. Make us an idol who can lead us. Are they nuts? Obviously. Make us an idol who can lead us. Because we don't know what will happen if we follow this fellow Moses. He's gone up the mountain and he hasn't come back. Aaron signs up to this. And of course the bronze calf is created that they worship. Because worshipping a golden statue is easier than waiting for what God might do. There's another mountain, centuries later. Another mountain, other followers of God, as Jesus goes up a mountain with Peter, James and John. And they see there transfigured before their eyes Jesus having a conversation with Elijah and Moses. The moment has come. This is what they're waiting for. Moses, Elijah, the two great founding fathers, and Jesus. Now we have it. Now we've got it. Let's build some tents for them. Let's capture this. This is what it's all about. This is what Jesus has been up to all of this time. We need to worship this moment. And then the cloud descends and they hear God's voice saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." It's misplaced worship, isn't it? Wrong place, wrong time. They're worshipping the moment. Do we know anything about that? Maybe. Going back to the Old Testament then. Well, it gets worse, doesn't it? They carry on. They carry on wandering in the wilderness. They have various grumblings and moanings along the way. But in Numbers 14, it's recorded at the point that they might have been entering the land of Canaan, and the spies go out to reconnoitre. They come back, and frankly, it's scary out there. My word, there's giants out there. We can't possibly go into that land. That can't possibly be what God intended for us. This is too difficult. And guess what they say? Wouldn't it be better if we went back to Egypt? We should choose a leader, it says, and go back to Egypt. Because going back seemed the better choice, really. To them, you either go back or we stay here and rot or get eaten by giants. We can't possibly go forward. Where's the sense of God's larger plan? It's got lost, hasn't it? It's got lost somewhere. Somewhere it's got lost. And as we know, their attitude leads them to wander around and around and around and around and around and around and around for a long time, going nowhere. Because they were too frightened. And so they turned back. Another story. A story of two women who actually do fix their eyes on the goal. A very familiar story that we read in the book of Ruth. Ruth and Naomi choosing to travel in desperation, in grieving, possibly, probably in danger, definitely towards an unknown future. And Naomi has just about enough faith, about this much faith, or even less, to know somehow, in some way, her God must be there if she returns to Bethlehem. You can't say she's got a blinding revelation, can you? You can't say that she knows for sure she's going to find the God of her forefathers again. No, she's desperate. She's desperate, she's grieving, she's lonely. She's prepared to take this journey on her own. And she arrives in Bethlehem, utterly miserable, as you know, and she finds somewhere to live. And she could easily have just breathed a sigh of relief. I've got a roof over my head. I'm back with people that I know. This is the land of my family. She uses the one bit of God-given knowledge she had, that her kinsman on her husband's side owns a field. And so she sends Ruth off to glean in this field, in an unknown land, a despised foreigner to go and glean in this field? Naomi could have stopped there because, well, then they've got enough to eat as well. They've got shelter, they've got friendship, they've got enough to eat. Life must be fine. Let's stay here. Let's pitch our tent here and now and stop. But whether she knew it or not, God's purposes were greater. And so she pushes forward. She fixes her eyes on a goal that I'm not even sure she quite knew was there, but she fixes her eyes on a goal and she hatches a plan, however strange that plan was. She didn't pitch her tent just yet because God wasn't finished. God wasn't finished. So there's something here then about pushing on, pressing on. We kind of got to go to the obvious place, really, haven't we? It's tempting. Could have skipped past Jesus, but perhaps I shouldn't. You know, General Secretary of the Baptist Union's here. Perhaps I better not skip Jesus. Partly because it's so obvious, isn't it? It's not just the answer to every Sunday school question, is it, Jesus? He is the answer. You see, Jesus always kept moving, didn't he? Jesus always kept moving. And every time the disciples thought they had arrived, I mean, the Transfiguration is the biggest example. Every time the disciples thought they'd got it, they understood it, they'd arrived, they could tie Jesus down, they could make sense of him. Oh, nope, he went off somewhere else. The Gospels are littered with examples of Jesus crossing to the other side, walking to a new town, choosing to go to different people, the Samaritans, the Gentiles of Decapolis, the untouchables. The whole time Jesus is pressing on and pressing on. Jesus even says of himself, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." And in that passage, he is warning his followers of the cost of following him, of leaving father and mother, of not knowing when you will see them again. Luke records a little earlier in that passage of Luke chapter 9 that actually Jesus set his face to Jerusalem at that point. It's the same chapter that has the Transfiguration within it. This glorious, beautiful, exciting time of worship on the mountaintop gives way to the road that was leading to pain and suffering as Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem. The disciples are trying to stop him. The disciples are saying no. Why? Jesus tries to describe the suffering that he has to enter into and what is going to happen. Peter cries out, "This will never happen." And he gets a harsh rebuke. "Get behind me, Satan," is Jesus' harsh rebuke. "Do not try to make me pitch my tent here." God's purposes are greater and they are over there. Jesus knows where he should go. It's not an easy, triumphant looking path, but he knows he has to go there. I'm nearly through with the journeying and the travelling. But then there's Paul. And recently, Stephen and I have been reading through the book of Acts, and just reading a book like that, you kind of see the energy and the journey and the travel that goes into it. Paul also turns his face to Jerusalem. And the disciples in Acts 21 try to stop him because Jerusalem was going to lead to Rome and Rome was going to lead to his death. He could have stayed in Ephesus, in Tyre, in Caesarea. He could have stayed where the church was blossoming and flourishing and growing well. Why did he have to go to Jerusalem? Why did he have to put himself in the place of the enemies? Because he knew, like Jesus, that he shouldn't settle for what just seems good, but go on for what is the best. I remember a very significant evening when I worked for Den Pethers at EBA Ministries. I used to run the gap year there, and I took the volunteers away for weeks training. And there was a very significant worship evening when a lady called Joy Clark had been preaching. And I remember grappling with the Lord. I had no idea I was going to be called into ministry, by the way. No dream of it. But I remember grappling with the Lord because the question she was asking was, do you want God's best? Or will you settle for second best? And I was just like punched in the stomach. And I'm saying, no, Lord, I want your best. I want your best, Lord. And in saying it, I knew I was saying something with great cost. There was some cost to that. Now, I think it's ultimately led to possibly where I stand right now, maybe. But I knew I had to cry out for God's best. And I had to do that and not settle for pitching my tent too early. In many ways, the job I did with Den at Vis-a-Vis was the most fun I've ever had in a job. It was just really enjoyable. And not to say this isn't enjoyable. You're all great. And so to settle in that place would have felt quite comfortable. And when I first shared with Den about the call to ministry, he did try and work out how maybe I could do that still within the organisation. He would, wouldn't he? Yeah. But I knew I couldn't settle. As part of my calling, long story, but Stephen and I went on a day out. I'd been advised to ignore this call to see whether it would go away, part of testing it. And so I had been ignoring it very carefully as we travelled to Wells Cathedral. I'd been reading a novel. I walked into Wells Cathedral and burst into tears. Stephen's like, what on earth's wrong with you? I need a cup of coffee. And when I could finally speak, I said, I have to lay my life down for the church. Sounds so dramatic. But God didn't want me to be satisfied with where I was or to be satisfied with second best. What about you? So what about you and I then now? We have the going and the travelling, the desire to settle but not settling. Have you lost sight of the fact that you're still called to journey? Do you remember the trembling excitement of your ordination? Do you remember the trembling excitement of when someone first confirmed your call? Do you recall that? And what did God say to you about your ministry at that time? There is still a journey for you to run, to go deeper and further. But how quickly we fall into the moaning and the grumbling, how quickly we forget the excitement of where we are. It's exciting because God has placed us there, not that it in itself might be exciting. Not everything in ministry is exciting, is it? You know, endlessly stacking chairs and folding up go-pack tables is not on anybody's level of excitement. It really isn't. But I remember doing an awful lot of that. Perhaps you've pitched your tent too early and you're grumbling and moaning and you're sitting in your car park because you can't quite see where you should be going because you stopped too soon. You thought you'd arrived. But there's a potential in you that God still wants to unlock. He still wants you to look for new horizons, but stay in the EBA, by the way. And then there's the waiting is just too hard. God said, God said, God said, God said, but I don't see it. Therefore, I'll do it. I'll fix it. I'll find a solution. We can create a better worship band. We can get a better sanctuary space. We can get another car park, whatever it is. But God said, wait. God said, wait. Are we prepared to wait for God's best? Or are we worshipping what looks great and shiny and sparkly? And then there's the turning back. Well, if this isn't working, this church is just rubbish. These people are the most difficult. So-and-so's church is not like this. Well, yes, it is. They're just not telling you. I'll go back. I'll go back to where I was. Even if it's not particularly but nice, it's got to be better than now. The alternative is to stop here, and that's not great. Or on the other hand, you think, well, it's too hard to push forward, so I'll just stop here. But rather we are called to something deeper, higher, wider and longer. Lynn has read to us from many a good intellectual book. I wish to read to you from Narnia. The last battle. They're going to the new Narnia. The unicorn cries, I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. The reason why we love the old Narnia is that sometimes it looked a little bit like this. And then we hear from Eustace. If one could run without getting tired, I don't think one would often want to do anything else, but there might be special reasons for stopping. And it was a special reason which made Eustace shout, I say, steady on. Look what we're coming to. You have to talk like that when you read Narnia. Well, he might well have said that, for now they saw before them the cauldron pool, and beyond the pool a high, unclimbable cliff. And pouring down the cliffs, thousands of tons of water every second, flashing like diamonds in some places dark and glassy green in others, the great waterfall, and already the thunder of it was in their ears. Don't stop, farther up and farther in, called Farsight, tilting his flight a little upwards. It's all very well for him, says Eustace. Don't stop, farther up, farther in, cried out Jewel. Take it in your stride. His voice could only just be heard above the roar of the water, but the next moment everyone saw that he had plunged into the pool, the helter-skelter behind him with splash after splash, and all the others did the same. The water was not bitingly as cold as they thought, but of a delicious, foamy coolness. They all found they were swimming straight for the waterfall. This is absolutely crazy, said Eustace to Edmund. I know, and yet, said Edmund. Isn't it wonderful, said Lucy. Have you noticed? One can't feel afraid, even if one wants to. Try it. By Jove, neither one can, said Eustace. They came to what seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle, an unclimbable rock face, an unclimbable waterfall. And yet the mythical creatures are crying out, farther up and farther in. Keep going. Just jump in and you can swim against the tide, is the cry. That's what we can do too. And we are called to go farther up and farther in. We're called to go deeper and higher and longer and further than we've ever been before. You're called to fulfill your very first calling. You're called not to pitch your tent too early, not to stop dreaming, not to stop believing, not to stop waiting for God's best, but to go for the very best that he has in store for you. For each one of you has been called and is equipped to serve God right where you are. But don't pitch your tent too early. Don't stop. Don't give up. Don't grumble. Don't worship anything else other than the Almighty God. Don't turn back. But as Paul writes, fix your eyes on the prize for which Christ has called us heavenward. Then let's see what God can do. Bless you.